So we've had a couple of mini lectures focused on what political science is and this big question that we were trying to get at, which how do you justify state coercion? And we took a look at a bunch of different philosophies. And what I ended up telling you was that from the ancient philosophers to the Enlightenment philosophers to the modern philosophers, these political philosophers have influenced and set up the American political system that you're familiar with today, and that you can't understand the constitutions of the United States without that. And yes, and I definitely mean for this S to be here. It is in fact plural, because we have had more than one constitution in the United States. As a matter of fact, by some reckoning, we have had many. We're going to talk about the Articles of Confederation. We're going to talk about state constitutions when they were still sovereign. We're going to talk about the Constitution with which you're familiar with today. And all of these, in addition to this political philosophy, has had a profound impact on the American political system. Now, to understand how we get through the constitutions that we have to understand the Revolution. Now, this is not a government class, so I'm not going to try to go through all the historical details of the revolutionary America. That's not our goal. But what we do need to do is recognize that political actors at the time don't understand what's happening. So when we talk about the revolution, it's really easy to go, oh yeah, revolution, boom, done. But for the people who were part of that, the power structure was very different. The power structure at that time was one that favored Great Britain significantly. Great Britain was, I mean, we wouldn't have used this term then, but we might as well kind of call it was a superpower at the time. It controlled most of the world. As a matter of fact, the United States and Great Britain, it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. And as a matter of fact, that wasn't wrong. That was accurate. Great Britain controlled a significant portion of the globe's continents. And so it would have been kind of for us to think about, say, some tiny country going up against the United States, maybe Hawaii, saying, we're going to be independent now, and you can't stop us. So we have to move past the foregone conclusions, because if we think about it this way, we're going to not understand why the people at the time behaved the way they did, because they didn't know what the ending was going to be. So let's see how we get past that. Here was the catalyst. The catalyst was the 7 Years' War. And in the United States, we actually called this the French and Indian War. In Europe, it was the 7 Years' War. And basically what ends up having to happen briefly is that Great Britain ends up having to send massive amounts of forces to the Americas to protect it from mainly the French, because the American colonies were simply not able to do this. And the war will actually last from 56 to 63. And like all big conflicts, it had a big price tag. And so in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, there's a big issue. And that question is how do we pay for the war? A question that we still even ask ourselves to this day about different conflicts. Great Britain decided for the first time that it was going to begin to tax the American colonies directly. In the past, the way that this had gone down is that Great Britain had demanded that states send part of their revenue back to Great Britain, but it was actually the states themselves that taxed the people. What happens in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War is Great Britain begins to impose direct taxation. But of course, American citizens as colonists do not have any representation in the Parliament of Great Britain. And so there's this big conflict between the two sides. Great Britain says, look, the United States, you received all of this direct military protection. You need to pay your fair share. And the colonists said, hey, we're not against paying our fair share, but what our problem is you can't directly tax us without representation. It's okay for the states to tax us because we get to send representatives to the states. We don't get to send representatives to Great Britain, to the Parliament. And that's going to be the disconnect between the two sides. I mean, as a matter of fact, the taxes that are the issue, for instance, the stamp tax, are actually very minimal compared to what you or I are accustomed to paying. But the question wasn't the price tag. The issue was we should have representation if you're going to tax us. And so as a result, a bunch of organizations will emerge, and one of the most important of these are the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. And they're going to basically be groups that are going to be the first kind of homegrown, hey, don't import things from Britain, let's not do things. As a matter of fact, if you want to know why we drink coffee in the United States, it's because we wanted to boycott the importation of tea. And this is going to culminate in December 16th, 1773, which what today we call the Boston Tea Party. What happens is that the Sons of Liberty and these other individuals in Boston, they dump a bunch of tea in the harbor, but we probably don't know why. The reason they end up dumping all the tea is because the tea is pre-tax. It's been paid. Today, import and export taxes are all this way, right? So when you buy a shirt, you don't pay the tax that it cost to send it from China, although you do. You just don't see it. Instead, the manufacturer has paid that cost to get it here, and then the retailer simply factors that cost into the final product. But that was not something that was done in this era. And in this era, you actually paid the tax as the purchaser. So when the East India Company begins losing out on its sales, it begins to pay the tax outright, and that's the tea that gets dumped in the harbor during the Boston Tea Party. And this is when George III is going to write that the time has come for the colonists to either submit or triumph, and no one thought that they were going to triumph. And this leads to a question. When is it? When is state coercion wrong? Remember, I told you we're going to get back to this, right? What about that state coercion? Well, a bunch of thinkers are going to point to Locke, and Locke is going to have a profound implication on the American Revolution. So after the Boston Tea Party, and into this milieu will come a man named Thomas Jefferson, the handsome fellow sitting right here. And he is going to pen, more or less, the Declaration of Independence. And I want you to listen to this anew. I'm going to read you a passage of it. And think about this carefully. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles, and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and their happiness. That's some big stuff. It's easy to just gloss over it because we're so used to hearing it. But think about this. Jefferson is going to be saying that there are certain things that people don't give up to the state. And when the state goes too far, you can kill to secure those rights. Those principles actually come directly from Locke. The idea that government is a two-way contract where you do not give up all your rights to the state and you have the right to change if the state becomes destructive of the ends. So men have unalienable rights. Governments get their power from the consent of the governed. And the way Locke put it is that you have your right to life, liberty, and property. Now, Thomas Jefferson will change that phrase from property to the pursuit of happiness. And he's actually trying to kind of expand on Locke. Because what he's saying is it's not just the ability to have stuff. It's the ability to dispose of that stuff in a way that you want, that a way that fulfills you, that makes you happy, right? So if creating these lectures on an iPad is what gets me up in the morning, then I have the right to do that. Or if driving my car, fast around the speedway track is what gets me up in the morning, I have a right to dispose of my property in that way. And other people can't tell me about what to do with it. Or if I want to drop it from the top of a building and watch it explode, that's what I could get to do too. So not just property, says Jefferson, but the pursuit of happiness. So see, the Declaration of Independence, and this is why we had to spend so much time with our Enlightenment theorist, is a social theory document. It's part of that social contract stuff we talked about. It says, here's the things governments can do, here's the things it can't. It's all about state coercion and the limits of state coercion. Now, that's all well and good. But here's the next thing that's kind of bizarre that comes back, and this time it comes back to Hobbes. And that's this. So you're going to find a revolution. You're going to take on the most powerful country in the entire world. So what do you do? Well, the first thing that the colonists end up doing is they end up saying, we need to create a new government. And this comes directly from Hobbes, because what Hobbes said is that anarchy is worse than anything else, right? Life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. So the very first thing you need to do if you're dissolving your connections with one government is create a new government. And that government will get pinned during the American Revolution. It's actually kind of bizarre if you think about it. And this is the first unique constitution for the United States. It's the Articles of Confederation. So in the United States, we're firstly British citizens, and so we're under the British Constitution. Then we have independent state constitutions, and then we have the Articles of Confederation. We're up to 3 constitutions, sort of, yet, and we haven't even made it to the one that you're familiar with. Now, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union are going to be written during the Revolution and passed into law by the Continental Congress in November 1777. And they're actually going to be the operating constitution for the United States for 12 years, from 1777 to 1787. And they're not a whole lot like, in some ways, our own Constitution. It's a little different. So let's take a look at some of those differences. One is that there's just a singular Congress. So there's no House and Senate. There's just basically kind of there really is just a Senate. And the only real power Congress is going to get is foreign policy. As a matter of fact, Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation said that every state would, quote, retain its sovereignty, freedom, and independence in every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States and Congress assembled. In other words, states remain sovereign. They remain the major state units, which is why we actually still call them states to this day. It was missing all kinds of things that you're used to. There was no president, i.e. no executive. There was no Congress. There was no judiciary because there was no laws passed by Congress over citizens. That was all handled by states. And so the Articles of Confederation was a very kind of different document. And it was a successful document in one sense, right? It's our Constitution during the War for Independence. So why do we end up changing the Articles of Confederation? Why the switch? Well, there are going to be actually two major problems. The first is an international problem, and the second is a domestic problem. The international problem is a problem with what to do after the war is over. So the war has ended, and when you end a war and you sign a peace treaty, all it says is I'm not going to shoot at you and you're not going to shoot at me. It doesn't tell us about how we're going to trade, how we're going to deal in the high seas, anything else. Just we're not shooting at each other anymore. And we actually send over to Great Britain one of our big diplomats, John Adams, to negotiate that treaty with Great Britain. Now here's the problem though. Adams, we're going to send him over from 86 to 87. Adams though, he was basically the number 2 on the hit list of people that the Great Britain wanted to kill during the Revolution. Right? Washington obviously was number 1 pretty quickly, but Adams was right up there with number 2. Imagine for an instance then, to make it, this is not perfectly identical, but it's close. Imagine if we had not been successful in Afghanistan. And so instead we end up suing for peace. Everybody's a little upset by this, of course. And so to negotiate the terms of our final peace treaty, and then our subsequent treaties, here comes Osama bin Laden. He's flying over into New York, and he's looking out the windows, and he's going, oh, look at that. You're missing some buildings. That's a little bit the way that the British people will see Adams. They're going to completely snub him, and instead they're going to deal, Great Britain will deal with each individual state at a time. So they're going to go to, Virginia and say, here's the deal we're going to make with you, so that when they go to Connecticut, they'll say, look, you got to at least start here. And they're making independent treaties with each of the states. And this is completely undermining the Articles of Confederation. And lots of people are really worried about that. So that's the international problem. Then we have a domestic problem. The domestic problem is Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shay was an army captain in the Revolutionary War. And what happens is lots of these guys who fought in the Revolution didn't get paid. They got paid infrequently, or they got paid in money that was not useful. In other words, it ended up being worthless. And so when they come home, when they come back, because they're mainly farmers, and they come back to Massachusetts, this is where Daniel Shay and many others are, they find that their land, now debt-ridden, is in foreclosure in western Massachusetts because they haven't been paying their taxes. But Daniel Shay and others say, wait a second, we can't pay our taxes because the Continental Congress wasn't paying us. What are we supposed to pay them with? We just fought a revolution to put down tyranny. We can do it again. And so they will actually seize control of the county courts in western Massachusetts from sitting, because the courts are the ones that execute the foreclosure proceedings to keep them from being able to put this through. Now, the state, by force no less, will be able to put down Shays' Rebellion, but just barely. And the inability of Congress or another national body to intervene was very worrisome. So you have a treaty with Great Britain and Shays' Rebellions are these two big issues. And as a result of this, a number of who will end up being considered the constitutional framers or the founders will want to call for a revision to the Articles of Confederation. And we're going to take a look at the constitutional connection in the next lecture.